Hey guys, in this new tutorial we're going to be going over the new Redshift Renderview and post effects. So in Redshift 2.633 the post effects were merged into the main builds and they updated the Redshift Renderview to include the new features. And so this is a pretty big update. A lot of people are wondering how to use them and how to what the render view features are, how to what basically all these new options do, how to use the post effects. And so I'm going to just go over all this stuff in this tutorial. Now this is going to be in Maya, but everything in this video applies to all the other apps, so just keep that in mind. They basically have all the same settings and options, with some slight differences here and there. So yeah, and I actually recorded this video earlier and forgot that my mic was off, so I'm going to voice over the hour-long video that I made earlier. And so basically, if you need to get the Redshift Renderview, you could go to the top and you'll find it up in the Redshift options, and there you could snap it into the Maya, the windows, just like. And Houdini also has the option to snap it into a panel. So keep that in mind. I'm not sure about Cinema 4D, but I assume you guys have something similar. So when you first click on the render view, it opens up empty. It's blank. Nothing is going on, and it actually doesn't start rendering until you tell it to. So the first option is the it's like a little film take, and so you click that, and that will actually give you a final render. So now you can see that the render is going. It's rendering in buckets, and that is an actual finished final render. So the final render will use the unified sampling system settings. So if you go to your options render settings, it's going to use all those options that you have in there. So whatever resolution and unified sampling settings, that's what that's going to use. It's assuming it's a final render. At the bottom you have some statistics. So you have the frame number, the time, the render time, the date, stuff like that. Now next to the final render button, we also have a little play button, and that's for our IPR. So when you click that, it activates progressive IPR mode, and so that will just update live. So the Redshift Shelf and all the other apps also have options to also open up the render view and either start a render or start the IPR. So you don't have to go to the top tab. You could also use the Redshift Shelf to open up the render view. So keep that in mind, guys. You don't have to go all the way up there. The Redshift Shelf lets you also do all this stuff. So if you hit the play button, it'll start progressive rendering, and you'll notice that there's a percentage bar that increases, and so that's firing as many rays as you have set up in the progressive rendering passes section of your render options. So right now we have 1024 render samples, and so as you move around, it's going to update live for you. And so that's basically how you activate progressive rendering. And so pretty much all you do is just move around, and the updates that you work like on your shaders or the objects will update live as you move around and do stuff. So keep that in mind. And it'll use the 1024 passes like I mentioned earlier. So you could adjust this to 16 or 128 and it'll render your passes faster than doing the full 1024. If you press the button again, that will stop progressive IPR mode. Now pressing it again obviously turns it back on, and we have several other options. We also have the option to use bucket mode. So you'll notice this little box with little boxes inside of it. That is the progressive IPR to switch to a bucket mode IPR. And so that will use buckets to render our scene, and it will use the settings that you have in your render settings, and it'll fire off buckets. Some people prefer to work this way because it uses your actual unified sampler settings, and you can actually make it update faster by increasing your adaptive error threshold. So let's say you bump it up to something like 0.1. That will update your buckets a lot faster because it's firing less ray samples. And so some people prefer to work this way instead of using the progressive mode, as this is technically considered like a final render in a way. So keep that in mind, that that's what that option does. The little boxes basically switches you from progressive rendering to IPR bucket rendering. That updates as you move around. And so if you want to disable that, all you got to do is just click on it again, and now it's back to progressive mode, where it renders progressively per pixel samples. Now, another option that we have is the undersampling. And so by default, it's set at 2. The IPR undersampling basically tells Redshift how many samples to skip when it first starts up. So 3, you'll notice that the when we move around, you get big old like pixel blocks, and that's because it's undersampling by 3. If you go to 0, it doesn't skip any pixels, and so every pixel is sampled. Now, depending on the scene complexity, you might want to have 0, where the scene's pretty simple, so you just want to get it going to the finished look faster. But if your scene's very complicated, you might need to use 2 or 3, where it skips pixels, and that keeps the scene more interactive while you move around. So something to keep in mind, that you could change the undersampling settings. Typically, the default of 2 is more than enough, though, for most scenarios. The reload button next to the play button lets you reload your scene. So let's say you moved something around and for some reason it didn't update. That's what the reload button does. Our next option is where it says beauty. This is where you'd find your AOVs. So right now we only have the beauty. We actually need to make some AOVs. So if we make a couple different AOVs for our scene, they're going to appear there, and we can actually preview them in our IPR mode, so we can see what our AOVs are actively doing. So for example, we make specular, we'll make reflection, and you'll notice that they show up now underneath beauty. So if we click around, we'll be able to switch between them. Depending on your scene, obviously this is using subsurface multiple scattering, so diffuse isn't going to do anything. So we need to actually activate our go to our, see, our reflection pass has reflections, and our SSS pass has our SSS. So keep that in mind, that some AOVs will show up and some won't, depending on your scene. Now, there's specific AOVs that cannot work in progressive mode. An example of this is crypto mat. So if we make a crypto mat, it will not be processed in progressive mode. Crypto mat requires a final render to be finished for it to work. Otherwise, it won't work, because it's processed at the end of your rendering, and so it runs as a separate process. So if we do a final render here, you'll notice that now our crypto mat is an option, and so there we go, we got our crypto mat. If you use progressive IPR bucket mode, it still won't show up. So keep in mind that crypto mat is one of those AOVs that requires a full final render for it to show up. So moving on, we'll go back to progressive mode. And like I mentioned, those AOVs will be there while you work. Our next option is our channels option. So this lets you switch between RGB, red, green, blue, and alpha channels. And that just lets you quickly switch between them. It has its own hotkeys that you could check out in the customization shortcuts section. I'm not going to go over that in detail because there's just a ton of hotkeys that you guys can check out, and you can customize the menus to do whatever you want with your own setups. So, but just check out the shortcuts menu. I recommend it. You'll learn how to use some of the shortcuts, and you'll also be able to customize it to your liking, which is pretty useful. Our next option is the denoiser button, and it's grayed out right now, and the reason is because there is no denoiser active. So let's go activate a denoiser so you guys can see what this button does. And so we're going to go to our render settings under the denoise tab. We're going to switch over to optics and give this a second to process. And now optics is active, and so optics basically will denoise your scene, and so it works on progressive or bucket mode. And so what that button does is it switches between the denoised or the noisy version. So if you click it, you'll notice that it goes from the denoised and to the noisy version. And basically all that's doing is swapping between the beauty, the denoised beauty AOV, and the noisy AOV. So if we zoom in, you'll notice here, if we click that, you'll notice that it shows us the noisy and the not noisy version as an option. So that lets you check it out really quickly without having to switch between the AOV from the beauty to the beauty noisy AOV. It's just a faster way to switch between the two. And again, this works also for bucket mode. So if we click on bucket IPR and we zoom in here, you could switch between noisy and optics. So let's increase our progressive passes to 256, and let's switch back to progressive mode. And we're actually going to look at the crop tool, the render region tool, I should say. So when you activate it, you can move it around. You can just click on it and drag it and move its location. You can scale it. And as you can see, when you do that, it renders only inside the render region. You can change the size and shape of it. And so this can be very useful when you're working on scenes that are a little complicated or complex, and you just want to check out the differences in small areas without having to render the entire scene and waste resources rendering everything. That's what this lets you do. So keep that in mind. And it works in both progressive and bucket mode. Now you could hold shift and left click, and that lets you quickly draw the shape. So if you hold shift and left click and drag the mouse, it makes the shape that you want, and then when you let go, it activates that as a render region. So keep that in mind. That's faster than clicking on the marquee and increasing or decreasing the shape. I just like to hold shift and click and drag and make the shape that I need. So clicking the icon again disables render region mode. So yeah, keep that in mind. That's really useful to use the hotkey to hold shift, click and drag, and it just lets you just quickly make a render region. So even with the render region tool not active, just holding the shift key and left clicking activates it and lets you draw it into the location that you need. Cool. So and keep in mind you can change the shortcut if you guys want it to be something else. Now our next option is our camera options. the camera settings basically that are found in your scene, it switches between the cameras. Right now we only have one camera, the perspective camera, so we're going to make a new camera. And using this new camera, we're going to then show you basically, I'll show you how to switch between cameras and how to lock the camera view and what they do. So we're going to make a new camera here. And we're going to call this new cam. And actually it didn't update the camera name. So right now it's still perspective 1. So let's pause it. We're going to just close the window real quick. And new cam is there as an option now. So let's start progressive mode. We're going to switch to perspective. And in our viewport, we're going to switch to perspective. And we're going to move that around. And so now we have a different angle for our perspective camera. And then we have our new cam, which saved the location. So this lets you switch between cameras in your scene. And then automatic mode just uses whatever view you're in currently as an option. So if we're in perspective mode, you'll notice that there's this other icon to the right that's highlighted blue, and it's a lock. And so that's the lock camera option. And so what that does is the render view will remain with that camera. It won't move around. Even though your viewport might be a different camera, it's going to stay on whatever camera you have currently locked and selected. So keep that in mind. And then auto just uses automatically whatever view or cameras in your viewport, it just picks that up. And then if you click the lock icon, it's going to lock it to that view. So something to keep in mind to if you need to lock a certain view, you could just use the lock icon and it'll stick to that camera angle. Cool. Now there's another option that's called interactive camera. This is currently only inside of Maya, but it will be available, I'm sure, for the other apps relatively soon. And so this lets you kind of work without using the viewport. So when you activate this icon, you can render and move the camera around inside of the Redshift Renderview. So if we click that, you'll notice that it turned blue and it's active. You can rotate, zoom, and move around the camera in the render view. Normally, when it isn't active, if you middle mouse click, holding Alt, it lets you pan the view, and if you hold Alt and right click or scroll the middle mouse wheel, it lets you zoom in and out. So right there, you could middle mouse click in and out, and that's 2D movement. But when you activate this, it lets you move inside of the 3D space. So if we hold Alt and the left mouse key, we're rotating just like you would in any 3D app. And let's actually disable optics for now. And so if I click and start dragging around with the Alt key and the left mouse button, we're rotating around our object. And without even using the viewport. Now if I move around, you know, it lets you basically fine tweak the angle and stuff, the look. And if you hold the Alt key and middle mouse click, you will pan around. So right here we're panning to the left, to the right, up, down. And so this lets you pan your render. The Alt left mouse click lets you rotate, and the Alt right click lets you zoom in and out. So here we're going to zoom in. and then you can zoom out. So the same way that you move around in the Maya viewport is the same way you move around inside the render view. And when you uncheck that, now it's back to 2D movement where you can move the canvas around or zoom in and out. So that's a pretty neat feature that was added. That's useful for navigating your scene without actually moving the viewport itself. And so we already went over the bucket rendering mode. So the next option is the freeze tessellation. So this is a really important feature that a lot of people don't know about. And so it looks like a little snowflake icon. And so to show you what that does is basically it freezes the tessellation if you're using adaptive tessellation displacement. And so let's actually hide our mesh object for now. And we're going to make a plane. And inside of this plane, we're going to just quickly add Redshift material, and we'll just add some noise to the Redshift material. And with the noise, Redshift noise, we're going to just add a displacement node, and we're going to connect that in to our displacement, and then we're going to just assign this shader to our plane object. And so, and we need to add the tessellation, the Redshift properties, tessellation and displacement. And in there, a lot of people wonder why when they're doing IPR, let's zoom in actually, they feel like, oh, the displacement's taking forever to update when I'm rotating or moving around. And a lot of people don't realize that the reason is because they're using adaptive tessellation. And so the way adaptive tessellation works is basically the closer that the object is to the camera, the more tessellation occurs because it's adaptive. It's relative to the object distance to the camera. So if the object is really far away, Redshift will not tessellate and add tons of geometry. If the object is really close, it's going to tessellate a lot so that you get all that detail. Now it's great for saving VRAM and stuff, but the problem with that feature is if you're in IPR and you're moving around the camera and getting closer and doing look dev, it has to recalculate the tessellation every time you move around. So in order to avoid this, you could freeze the current tessellation. That's option A. Or option B is you don't use adaptive tessellation and you just tessellate the object equally no matter how far away it is from the camera. And that will just process the tessellation displacement one time. And then you can just move around all you want. Now, that Arnold, for example, by default does that. Redshift by default uses adaptive tessellation. So if we, for example, right here, I'll show you the screen space adaptive. If we disable that, it's going to use regular world space tessellation so that the tessellation is the same no matter how close or far away I am. And like I mentioned, Arnold uses this by default. So some people coming from Arnold are wondering why the updates aren't fast. And so when using displacement. And that's the reason. You could either use that or you could use the freeze tessellation icon, which is the option that I was mentioning up in the render view with the snowflake. So if we zoom out a lot, Redshift automatically will not tessellate the scene as much, right? And let's say we press freeze tessellation. It's going to lock in the adaptive tessellation options. So if we zoom in now, it's not going to automatically recalculate our tessellation. But you'll notice that it's really blocky. And the reason is because it froze the tessellation settings from that distance. And it's not updating every time because we're moving the camera around. So if we unfreeze, you'll notice that now it's smooth again. And that's because we're close to the object. And so you basically, if you're going to be working with adaptive tessellation, and you want fast IPR updates, you have two choices. You could either disable screen space adaptive, or you can freeze the tessellation. And that means Redshift will only calculate it one time. And that way you could just update, move around the camera and stuff, and it won't have to reprocess the tessellation displacement. So right here we're going to use world space displacement, and we're going to use a minimum edge length of 0.1. And so right now if I rotate around, it's not having to recompute our tessellation because our object is using the same tessellation no matter how close, far away the camera and object are relative to each other. But like I said, adaptive tessellation is better if you want to save VRAM and your object isn't moving around. So just freeze the tessellation, and it's basically the same thing. Now you locked in that tessellation quality, and so you can move around, and the look dev process is a lot smoother and faster. So really important feature that a lot of people don't know about for some reason. And yeah, I just recommend everyone uses that when they're using adaptive tessellation displacement to freeze that. So let's hide our plane, and let's go back to our mesh object. Let's move on to the next settings. And so our next option, it's kind of like the utility overrides. So regular mode is the circle, an empty circle. Clay mode lets you override your entire scene with the clay shader, which is good if you're checking out lighting. And if you click on the icon again, it'll go back to regular mode. And then there's samples mode. And so samples mode basically tells you where you're firing your most samples. So a brighter white color means more samples are being used there. So this lets you figure out where you're having sampling issues or where your scene needs more samples. So that's what that option is for. And that option has to use bucket mode, just so you guys know. So we're going to go back to progressive mode, and we're back to regular. So that's what those three utility options are for. And our next settings are for snapshots. So if you click that icon, it opens up the snapshots menu. And so in the snapshots menu, you can basically get a little bit of information about your current scene. You have the render time, the resolution, the time it took. You can add notes. So if you double click the notes area, you can type in whatever you want, IPR test. And now at the bottom, we have that note that says IPR test. So that's useful if you want to save some custom information in there. Now in the customize settings option, there's a snapshot section. You can actually move the snapshots menu to either be on the left or on the bottom, and you can adjust what gets automatically saved in your snapshots data. So you could choose like the export time, the camera that got used. So if we select camera, for example, and right now it hasn't updated, we need to reload the scene. You'll notice at the bottom, when the render finishes rendering, that we're going to have something that says camera. And so right now, if you look down there, you notice it says camera persp. And so it's stamped our render with that information. So you could add that data in there if you want, the metadata. And yeah, and if you want to save a snapshot now, that's what the icon to the right of that does with the little plus. You click on that, and now it's saved a snapshot image. So let's rotate around and let's click on it again, and now we have our snapshots. So we have image 1, and when you have it highlighted, you'll notice that it selects it with the blue around it, and when you don't, it goes back to whatever your live render view is. Let's move it back down to the bottom. I prefer it this way. And so if you click, you could switch between them, and the data will be inside of the metadata. And so you could load the post effects. This, I'll go over it later. There's a little cog wheel, which is the snapshot settings. And so this is where you could save the snapshot path. So let's say you have a project and you need to save all your snapshots into a certain folder. This is where you need to do that. So you tell it, I want to save all my snapshots into this folder. So you might select a path somewhere where your project is. Then you could save it as an EXR. So your snapshots are not saved as a Redshift format. They'll be saved as EXRs. There's also the apply post effects and the auto load. So all these options, basically, when you first start your scene, you might want to set this up so that way it's automatically ready to go next time you load. You'll have your snapshots folder. It'll automatically load the post effects for your snapshots, and it'll save them as EXRs. Now, another neat feature that got added was the ability to set a swipe system. So you could set image A and B so you can do comparisons between the two. And it's really a really useful system. It's very similar to Nukes. If you right-click your image, those options appear there also. So you could set image A, set image B. You could delete it, and you could compare the settings that were saved between images. Currently, that setup data isn't there, so it's empty. So now we set A, and again, like I mentioned, none of that data is there. Set B, and now we have two images. And if you guys are familiar with Nuke, it's basically the same swipe system to do the comparison between the two images. So there's the middle button that lets you slide the swipe around. So if you click and drag around, it moves the center. So you can swipe between the two images. The icon to the right lets you rotate the swipe. And then that icon right there with a curve lets you switch the opacity. So you can go full strength all the way to 0. So as you can see, this is a really powerful, useful swipe system. I know that a lot of other render views have just really basic swipes, and so I'm really glad that they approached the swipe tool to be very useful, like the Nuke version. So that covers the swipe system. Another useful option, and like I said, all these settings, to activate A and B and snapshots, they're all inside the hotkeys list. So, but anyways, moving on, the copy frame buffer, the last icon on that list, it's basically just a copy paste. So it quickly copies whatever is in your frame buffer. And let's say you open Photoshop and you just paste, you're going to paste in exactly that image. So it's just that way you don't have to save an actual render. You could just copy paste, and that's useful. Now our last option here, coming into the right, is the zoom scaling. And so the percentage there that you're seeing isn't an actual zoom that is zooming in resolution. It's zooming in just the screen. So there's other options to the right of this, like the original size. So original size is just using whatever is in your render settings. So if we go to our render settings, that resolution is what original size is. Now fixed scaling lets you adjust the resolution, the actual resolution, not the zoom value, but the resolution by a percentage. So right now, if we switch this to 200, it's going to render 200%. So it's doubling the resolution that we have inside of our render settings. So this can be useful if you want to double the resolution. Or if you're doing look dev, sometimes you want less resolution. You want half the resolution. So even though you have your render settings set at, 1080p, maybe you want to do half res because you want faster look dev. So you type in 50%, and now it's doing 720p. So that's really useful. I actually use fixed scaling all the time because it lets me quickly go to high res or low res. So keep that in mind if that's what that's for. Since a lot of people ask how to do that, that's what fixed scaling does. It lets you adjust the scene resolution. Now, fit window basically fits the current resolution to the window. So if you make a small window, it's making the resolution smaller. If you make a big window, it's going to make the same aspect ratio, but just bigger. And finally, we have the fill window. And this basically doesn't use your aspect ratio. It just makes it as big as the window is. So if your window is big, vertically, it's going to just fill in the vertical space. And so that's how that works. I personally don't use the fill and fit window settings often. I usually stick to fixed scaling and original. I find them to be more useful. But those options are there for people that might want to use them. Moving on. Here's some of the hotkeys, like snapshots is the S key. And we also have hotkeys to frame the render and also to rotate the render around. And so, or to also zoom in 100% or reset the zoom in. So the rotation hotkeys are really useful. There's H and V for horizontal and vertical. And if you zoom in and you press F, the F key will zoom out fully. It basically full screens. Now the horizontal and vertical, and you could rotate 90 degrees options, they're actually very useful if you want to check your composition. I actually requested these options because it seems like no other render views do this except for RenderMan. And so this is very useful if you want to just quickly rotate your image and check the composition. Sometimes you don't want to save the image, open Photoshop, and check the composition. That takes a lot of work. So this just makes it easy. You can just rotate and flip the renders around. And this just lets you see if the composition's working for you or not. And I use this all the time to just kind of look at the image differently. Pretty useful, again, and the hotkeys H, so keep that in mind, and you can customize it to whatever you want. Now, moving on, we're going to now check out the post effects settings and the render view options. So when you click that little cogwheel on the right, you'll get all these settings here. And so this is under the display tab. You'll get apply to file output, the enable post effects, the color management, and all that stuff. And that's related to how you could save the image, whether you want to save the image with post effects or not. And then you have all our other options like LUTs, color controls, photographic exposure, and so on. Then we have the pixel tab. The pixel tab basically lets you gather pixel information. So if you hold the control key and you move around and then you click, it'll get the pixel data. And just like in Nuke, when you click and drag, it'll get the average pixel data in that region. So right there you can see in the beauty we have the RGBA and display data. And so if we click on an area and have the control key held down, it'll select and give us that pixel data. If you just hold control over an area, a little window pops up also that has some of that information. So as you can see, if I drag around, you're getting all that pixel data. But only for the beauty. So if you want to get the pixel data for your AOVs, you need to have the pixel menu open, and you need to actually select a pixel. And again, the settings for that could be edited yourself using the hotkey menu. Now, something else to keep in mind is the post effects. You do not need to be rendering in progressive mode. They actually work through OpenGL. And before we go on to that, another thing is if you want to get rid of the selection, you can just hold Control and right click, and it'll get rid of it. So holding Control and left click makes the pixel selection, and holding Control and right click gets rid of it. So just something to keep in mind. So hold Control, right click, and it goes away. Moving on, we have our color management system and the post effects menus. And so our display mode, this is basically our generic display. We have linear, sRGB, Rec 709, a custom gamma if you need to use a different gamma profile, and then OCIO, which is a little more advanced. And you can use your own OCIO configuration path. And so I have a custom OCIO I use that emulates some camera profiles that I made. And this, you can middle mouse scroll, and you can just switch between all the OCIO profiles. So I have some different cameras like Kodak and Fuji and stuff like that. And so the OCIO profile system is really powerful. It works across multiple apps, and you could use log and stuff like that. And you could customize it to build your own. I'm not going to go over all that. That's a whole different subject. But just know that if you have an OCIO profile, you could use it here. Our next section is the LUTs. But let's first move back to Rec 709, something basic. And all these options, you can activate them with a checkbox. So we're going to bring down the LUT menu, activate it. And Redshift ships with a bunch of different LUTs built in. So if you click on that LUT path, you'll get a bunch of folders. If you're used to the LUTs from Octane, Corona, F-Storm, they're all included here. They're all open source LUTs, so any of those LUTs you need, they're all included. And so we're going to use a LUT here. We're going to just pick one. Let's go with the Fuji Eterna. And so we have several different options here. You can click on this and scroll through and select different ones, or you can middle mouse scroll and switch between them. We have the LUT strength slider that lets you control how strong the LUT is. So you can see what it's doing. We have the two other options to apply the color management before the LUT. So the color management is basically, are we going to apply Rec 709 or linear space first and then the LUT after? So that's important to know for certain LUTs, the order of operations. Not all LUTs are made the same. Some LUTs require linear space first. Some need sRGB. Some are log space LUTs, and so you might need OCIO in a specific camera log space. So all those things, that's a little more advanced. I'm not going to go over all the color management stuff since that's a whole entire subject unto itself. Then we have the convert to log space before applying the LUT. So some LUTs require a log input. And Redshift by default uses Cineon log, which is kind of a universal generic log. So we're going to use the RE log C to 709 LUT, and you'll notice that it looks a little weird. We actually need linear mode. And so this is how to actually look at the LUT somewhat correctly. Now, the actual way to look at this LUT is that we need to use RE log C, and then it's going to convert it to Rec 709. And you want to have convert to color management first to linear. But because Redshift doesn't have every type of log space imaginable, because there's just so many different log spaces, it ships with just Cineon, which is pretty generic flat log profile that most apps like Photoshop and everything comes with nowadays. Now, it gets you mostly there. It looks pretty close. Now, to actually be accurate, I actually have RE log C on my custom OCIO. So if I switch to RE log C and I apply the color management before the LUT, this is the way that LUT is actually supposed to look. It's supposed to have RE log C as the input space, and then it's supposed to go to 709 after. But like I said, the devs can't include every kind of log space imaginable. There's so many options. So they just gave us a generic Cineon log space. But just in case you guys want to match it, remember that it's using Cineon when it's converting the to log space. It's Cineon log. But yeah, that gets us close enough. You know, it's not perfect, a perfect match to actual RE log C or Panasonic vlog or all that, but it's close enough. Now, moving on from LUTs, we have the color control options. And oh yeah, and we can actually save presets. So you could reset the presets to default, or you could save them and load them with a little icon right next to the checkbox. And that lets you, if you want to save a preset like the curves or something and you want to share it, you can share it with other people that way. So another, something to keep in mind too, that all these options can be saved as presets. Now the curves options, they let you switch the curves. We have exposure and contrast. So a little simple exposure slider. And you'll notice that the curves are updating live, the histogram. Then we have the contrast where we can increase or decrease the contrast. And our curves, you can just double click on the curve and it'll drop a point and you can drag it around. And so that gives us tons of control right there to adjust our render using curves. And you could actually adjust per channel. So you could adjust red, green, and blue curves too, not just the entire curve across the entire image. So right here we're going to tone down our reds a little bit. And you could actually adjust the ends also. And if you want to delete a curve, you could actually click on the point and drag it off like you would in Photoshop. So if you click the point, and let's say you don't want it anymore, you can just drag it off. And there it's gone. And so that can be pretty useful. And we're going to just disable our curves probably. Or let's adjust the blue. And add a little more green. And yeah, as you guys can see, the curves are really powerful. You can just tweak the image all you want. So you don't even have to use a LUT if you don't want to. You could adjust the colors and stuff yourself using curves. Now our next option is the photographic exposure. And so this lets us control several values like the tone mapping, the brightness and darkness of the image like you would a camera. So if you're familiar with photographic camera terms, they have film speed, shutter time, f-stop. So like if we move the f-stop, we're going to get a darker image or a brighter image. We have the white point that brings up a color wheel and a color picker. So we can color pick our white point based on our render, or we can manually move the point around either on the color wheel or on our hue saturation value sliders. So here we're going to get rid of some of that warm by using a warm white point. And so that's what that does. And if you click on the white point option again, it'll shrink that. Now we have our vignetting option. So this lets you do the vignetting. The allowed desaturation desaturates the highlights. The allowed overexposure basically controls how much the image can be overexposed. If you're used to Corona, they call that highlight compression. This is the opposite of that. So instead of compressing highlights, it's how much highlights can be exposed. Then we have our black crush, which lets you crush the shadows to be darker. And our threshold, which lets you adjust how much of the threshold black crush is allowable. So if you want only certain spots to be black crushed. Then we have our saturation that does, saturation. So you could add a little more saturation or desaturate your image. It's pretty straightforward. Now moving on to our bloom, flare, and streak. Our bloom options. We'll add bloom, and actually you can't really notice it too much from this angle. So let's look at a bright highlight. So we're going to rotate around and look at the sun so you can see these post effects a little better. Let's move around. And these effects have been highly requested for a long time. People coming from other engines have requested this stuff, so it's finally here. And they're very robust. Lots of options you can control. So here, this is a good angle with the sun and some strong highlights in a couple spots. So these effects don't need the render to be on. They can be done on still images. And we're going to zoom in here. And we're going to adjust the bloom threshold. So the bloom threshold basically says how what white point is needed to actually be a bloom. So if you go all the way to the right, that means basically it has to be 50 intensity or higher. All the way to the left means 1 intensity or higher. By default, Redshift uses 4 as the maximum intensity value that can be achieved. They recommend 16 for post effects when you're using bloom and glare. This will add a little bit more noise to your highlights. So something to keep in mind, but it makes it easier to detect where bloom and glare and stuff like that should be active. So now you can see that the really strong white highlighted areas have the bloom effect. And so, but you'll notice that they're a little bit noisier. So just keep that in mind. You might need a little more samples when working with higher max subsample intensities. And so if we adjust the threshold, you can see where the bloom and glare will be applied. Off, on, so you can see it. And you could adjust how soft the bloom is. You can adjust the intensity, so it's off, really intense. And then we have also the bloom tint, which is basically like a gradient of colors of the bloom. So right now we'll make it red here, and we'll just have a gradient of color. And you'll notice that the bloom is slowly changing colors. Now it's a little more reddish purpley. And yeah, so you can see that the bloom now shifted colors, and it's basically a gradient of colors. So that's what that does. Now let's move on to our flare. So let's activate flare, and you can't really see it that well, so let's increase the threshold and the intensity, and now you can see it. And you'll notice that there's our flare shapes. You can increase the flare size. You can change the chromatic aberration in the flare to be a lot or a little more subtle. You can change the softness. The halo is the halo of the flare. You guys might not be able to see it. It's really subtle on the YouTube video. You might not see it, but you guys will know what it is when you adjust it. And it's the haloing artifact of the lens. It's a subtle effect. And then flare tint does the same thing as the bloom tint. It basically lets you adjust the color gradient. Let's move on to the streak. Now the streaks, you'll notice that they add little streaks. It's similar settings. You could adjust the threshold of where streaks are available and will appear. You could adjust how soft the streaks are. The tail lets you adjust how big the streaks are. So you can make the size different. The streak number lets you change how many streaks are going across. So 1 gives you basically horizontal streaks. You can add more or less to your liking. Then we have the streak angle. This lets you rotate the direction of the streaks. And then we have streak intensity also, that lets you basically just adjust how strong or how weak the streaks are. So that basically covers our post effects. And our final option is our render info. And so what this is our stamped information. So if we do a render, at the bottom you'll notice that it says frame 1, the date, the time, stuff like that, right? You could move that, and you could also adjust the metadata that appears there. So down here, if you check the format and the H-align and V-align, that's the location. So you can move where that appears, left, right, center. And the format, when you right-click this, it will give you different options that you could add. So you could add the camera, the frame number, the export time, the scene name, stuff like that. And so all this metadata gets written out, so you get that information at the bottom. And currently you can't write custom metadata, I don't think, but the goal is to be able to open that up. So for studios and different pipelines, you could write this metadata out and use it for organization purposes and stuff like that, for scene management. So yeah, keep that in mind. You could do that. You could, of course, erase everything, and then you won't get any stamped information. And now it's empty. Cool. So yeah, that about covers all the post effects options and settings that we have on the sides. And like I said, you could right click and add those tokens, and that metadata will be written out. And for our final options, how do you write this how do you write this out? How do you write a file out with the post effects? So if you click on enable post effects or disable, obviously it enables or disables. The apply file output applies the post effects to your file output. And so when you go to file, there's two ways of saving an image. There's save multilayer EXR, or just the regular save image. And the save multilayer EXR will save all your AOVs in your scene into one EXR file. So that's how that works. So if we were to save that, and then there's the save image, which lets you save an individual image. And so there's different options here. There's EXR, JPEG, PNG, different formats that you guys are all used to. high dynamic range or low dynamic range formats. And then there's options, so you could change the compression type. So for JPEG, there's quality. You could have it at 95. You could have TIFF compression types. You could have EXR, different compressions. So there's like Pixar 24, DWAA, DWAB, which are lossy, and so the EXR files are a lot smaller. So there's different formats you guys can switch to before saving your image out. And then finally, you could load a snapshot inside of your frame buffer using the load snapshot options. Now, something to deal with when it comes to post effects and your snapshots that we've saved. And actually, let's before we go over that, how do we save these settings? Let's say, because some people are getting confused, that I've noticed that the post effects aren't being applied to their renders, like their EXRs, and the reason is in your render settings you'll have different options. So there's LDR, which is low dynamic range, like JPEGs, PNGs. Then there's HDR, and then there's batch rendering, like the Maya render view. And so normally by default, the color and LUT options are enabled only for low dynamic range images like JPEGs, PNGs, so it'll bake it in. And then when you're using HDR formats like EXR, they're disabled. And the reason is because you don't want to bake a LUT normally into your linear image, right? So by default, those options are disabled. The photographic exposure options you can disable also if you want, and bloom and glare are also options you can uncheck. So for compositing pipelines, normally you don't want to add the LUT into your file. So that's why by default that's disabled. But if you want to add it into your batch files, you can activate it in the render settings for your color management. So keep that in mind, guys, that by default, high dynamic range images like EXRs do not bake in the LUTs and color options. Low dynamic range images bake in everything. So but you have the option to do that if you need to. Now moving on to snapshots. In our snapshots menu, let's actually delete those. You could the snapshots themselves actually save in the post effects metadata. So if I make a snapshot, right, of this image, and let's just make a different post effects version. So let's change the LUT, and let's adjust the, I don't know, the streaks or something. And let's add more vignette and change the f-stop. So we have different post effects now, and we're going to save another snapshot. You'll notice that when I click between them, it automatically loads the two different post effects settings we used in our snapshots. And you have the option of right-clicking and loading the post effects manually, but to do that, you need to switch Apply Post Effects off. So when you have Apply Post Effects activated in your snapshot settings, it automatically will load them. Now that we have Apply Post Effects off, it's no longer switching the post effects automatically. So we have to actually save a new version. So let's go save a snapshot. And now when I right click and load the post effects between these, you'll notice that it loads them. So this is how you can load post effects manually across different snapshots. So let's say you have adjustments in your render, but you want to keep the same post effects. This is how you can do it. And it'll just load them manually for you. Or, like, I personally prefer to keep it automatic so that it'll just load the post effects that I saved the snapshot with. But that's, that's an option. in the snapshot settings. So if you apply automatic, you just click and it automatically switches between them. Cool. And right click will delete those, and now we've got two different post effects, same render, but two different snapshots with different settings, and it automatically loads them up. And again, you know, we've got all these options to mess around with. There's tons of hotkeys. And another thing you guys need to know is if you're going to swipe between A and B, the post effects do not work. They between two separate images this way, unfortunately. And that's just because the way they're applied across the whole image. So you can't just like apply post effects on one half and apply post effects on the other half. So that won't work. So you can't swipe post effects. Maybe they could add this later in the future, but yeah, just so you guys know that the A and B feature is only meant so you can swipe between two actual different renders, like rendered data, not swiping between post effects. And yeah, I think that about covers most of these options and settings. Hopefully you guys now know how to use all the options in the post effects, what all the icons on the top do, how to customize your hotkeys, how to use the pixel sampler, how to use the snapshot system, how to use the A and B swipe snapshotting. Like I mentioned, the new post effects build is really robust, lots of options, tons of controls in your post effects settings that you could tweak, your photographic exposures, the curves, the flares, the bloom, and all these hotkeys you could customize to do whatever you need it to do. So it's very robust. Actually, one of the most powerful render views I think in the market right now, because it has so many options and so much control, and so it opens it up to a lot of customization. But yeah, hopefully you guys learned something, and this helps new users using the new post effects options that did not test out the alpha, that you guys can just jump in and start using all these new really cool features. I want to say thank you to everybody on my that has supported me on my Patreon. I really appreciate it. I know I haven't made too many free YouTube videos lately. I've just been busy with work and other stuff, and so I am hoping to make another new Maya video showing the new Maya fluids now that they're supported directly. So I'll probably be making that next. I figured I'd make this first because this is new and every app uses all this stuff. So hopefully this helps everybody, not just the Maya users. But yeah, thanks again, guys, for all the support. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to any cool stuff you guys make. And follow me on Patreon and on Facebook or Twitter. And yeah, thanks again.